Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming out on this evening. I'm Sue Jester. I'm the Director of Research here at the Huntington. It is always a special occasion for me when I get to introduce the current Robert C. Ritchie Distinguished Fellow in Early American History, who, as you know, this year is Serena Zabin. As the former Ritchie Fellow, myself, standing before you in the Roy Ritchie Auditorium, this is an occasion to celebrate Roy's many contributions to the Huntington and to honor the field that he, Serena, and I are so proud to call our own. We have at least 2 former Ritchie Fellows, I think, also in our audience tonight. As this audience surely knows, Roy was the Director of Research here from 1992 to 2011, a really momentous 20-year period in which he transformed the fellowship program into the largest, and I would say best, of its kind in the US. I share something else with tonight's speaker, Serena. We spent most of our academic careers at a single institution. Academic lifers are rare, and we deserve to be celebrated for the energy, dedication, and lifetime of service that we give to our home institutions. Serena has spent her career at Carleton College, which is, I'm sure you all know, a renowned liberal arts college in Minnesota, where she rose to the ranks, starting as a postdoctoral fellow in 2002, and now, where she is now, the Stephen R. Lewis Jr. Professor of History in the Liberal Arts. She has given her heart and soul to Carleton, serving for many years as the chair of the history department and also running the American Studies program as well, which is a really remarkable record of continuous service. But moreover, and more importantly for us, she is the author of 3 acclaimed books and a really innovative teacher, helping, to give just one example, to create with her students an immersive 3-dimensional digital video game about the 1770 Boston Massacre, which not accidentally is the subject of her most recent book. I think this synergy between the classroom and the archive is what scholars at liberal arts colleges do every day, and Serena is among the best of these. Her 2020 book, The Boston Massacre, A Family History, is a multi-layered story of the origins of the American Revolution, with a wide cast of characters, from the British soldiers who made their way from Ireland to Boston in 1768, to the regimental wives and children who accompanied them and in turn became neighbors of their colonial counterparts, finding common cause in the search for a lost child, trading insults in the streets of Boston, and sharing baptisms. As one fellow historian wrote of the book, the Boston Massacre is, quote, an intimate, complex, and moving picture of the friendships and family connections between Britons and Bostonians in the throes of revolutionary change. Zabin's eloquent account illuminates the ways in which actors in this nation-breaking and empire-breaking drama experience the rupture of a world they made together. I think at a moment when political tensions are riding high and violence threatens our own civic order, this 18th century story of how the shedding of blood between people who were once neighbors helped ignite a bitter war is a very timely lesson for us. Here at the Huntington, Serena is continuing this exploration of the familial and political terrain of the Revolutionary era, but this time through the eyes of a single woman. Mary Fish Noyes Silliman Dickinson, which is a mouthful, a Connecticut, quote, serial monogamist, in Serena's wonderful phrase, who lived through a very tumultuous time. Mary Fish is most remarkable for the remarkable archive she left to us, nearly 1,000 letters, some of which Serena will share with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Serena Zabin.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue, for that wonderful introduction. And indeed, thank you, Sue, and the whole research division for making this such a happy and productive place to work. I want to give a special thanks to my fellow fellows who have been by my side as I've been doing this work all year. And I want to thank all of you for being here. One of my favorite parts of being a historian is the chance to tell a story. So I'm going to invite all of you now to sit back and let yourselves be transported to another time and place. 3,000 miles away in New Haven, Connecticut, and 252 years ago, a Connecticut woman in her 30s pulled a piece of paper towards her and started to sketch in words a portrait of her ideal husband. Over roughly 3 pages, she tried to write out for herself exactly what she hoped an 18th century marriage would be. Her ideal husband would have to be, she began, a kindred soul with whom she would have a connection of both friendship and ardent affection. But then she corrected herself. These ideas seemed too general. Instead, she wrote, "I will say what composes the accomplished man." Honestly, that is a good question. Who was this woman trying to define a perfect husband in 1773, just months before colonists threw tea into Boston Harbor? This is a story about a woman named Mary Fish who lived from 1736 to 1818. She was an unpublished writer, a fierce supporter of the American Revolution, a deeply religious Congregationalist, an enslaver for much of her life, a matriarch of a sprawling and complicated family, and an impressively tough woman who outlived her 3 husbands. I've been spending a lot of time with Mary Fish this year. As with all new friends, it's taking me a little while to get to know her, and she's certainly no paragon of virtue, but she is proving to be an amazing guide to a past that I thought I knew pretty well. So tonight, I want to give you a little sense of this woman, her life, and especially her writings, including her reflections on marriage. She lived to be 82 years old, so the next half an hour will not give you an exhaustive biography. But I think it will give you a sense of why I've been finding her so fascinating, and also how her life as a pretty obscure Connecticut housewife can reveal some amazing stories about the American Revolution and the early years of the United States. I found my way to Mary Fish, in some ways as Sue just told us, through some of the questions that I had been exploring in my last book on the American Revolution. In that book, which was about the Boston Massacre, I showed how stories of politics and the military were also really family stories, untangling the ways in which this notion of family could be both a powerful political metaphor and a complicated personal choice, helped me notice in other places in 18th century America where small personal stories turned out to be crucial parts of much larger epics. I'm not actually the first historian to fall under Mary Fish's spell. About 40 years ago, a husband and wife team, a journalist, Joy Day Buell, and historian Richard Buell, Jr., brought her to the attention of other historians. They were the first to discover the large cache of her letters that had been preserved by her youngest son, Benjamin Silliman, and deposited with his own papers at Yale University. Spurred by the exciting scholarship in women's history that was emerging in the late 1970s and 1980s, they produced a biography of Fish that they called The Way of Duty, A Woman and Her Family in 18th Century America. At the time, the book was a major contribution, but these days, Mary Fish is in need of a major update. We could start with the title. I don't think The Way of Duty is a tagline we use anymore to talk about women's lives. More than that, though, at the time they wrote the book, historians were struggling to figure out how to fit women's lives into the political world of the American Revolution. Because Fish could never join the army or vote, she seemed to live outside the world of war and politics. In the Buell's book, the American Revolution was significant only in the ways that it affected her husband. In the last 3 to 4 decades, however, our understanding of the impact of the American Revolution on women's lives has grown dramatically. Historians have shown us how women's trading and shopping shaped political arguments over taxes. We've learned how women's work and women's bodies were essential to 18th century warfare, regardless of their political affiliations, their race, or their nationality. We've learned that women made political as well as material contributions to the American founding. And sadly, we've also come to see some of the ways in which those contributions were regularly swept under the rug at the time as well as later. And as for the revolution itself, historians are still documenting the ways that the home front and the battlefront came together. New work is showing us how households could be the places where soldiers and civilians, men and women, slaves and enslavers fought over the experiences and the meaning of the American Revolution. And finally, there have been enormous advances in the ways that we interpret sources, our sources from the past. I have to give a shout out here, some of you know what this is, to a book that influenced a whole generation of historians, a 1992 book about a midwife in 18th century Maine. The book was called A Midwife's Tale, and the historian, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, showed us how accounts of work and lives that seem small and trivial were, in fact, richly textured sources that describe a lost world. I actually think this book is having a renaissance through the historical mystery based on it called The Frozen River. I was at a party last week with a bunch of Huntington folks, and they were all reading it. So turn back to this book. At any rate, these methodological innovations, which happened nearly a decade after the Buell's book, were essential for me as I started taking another look at Mary Fish. I discovered that Fish had left behind an enormous collection of letters. As Sue said, maybe 1,000 or so. There we are, some of them. Oh, sorry, it skipped. Nearly 1,000 or so letters, which are in the archive at Yale, and I can talk in the Q&A if people are interested about how they got there. But I've discovered many more. Now, I have to say that almost all of these letters are scattered throughout historical societies in Connecticut, not at the Huntington. But it was only here at the Huntington with this amazing society of fellow scholars that I was able to start puzzling out the meanings of these letters, and especially how this one woman's story was part of the much larger tale of the origins of the United States. So, with that introduction, let me turn back to Mary Fish. Born in 1736 in Stonington, Connecticut, Fish was the oldest of 3 children and the only one to survive past 25. She married first at 22 and moved to New Haven, where her husband, John Noyes, and her father-in-law were both ordained ministers, as her own father was. There she gave birth to 5 children. Her 3 sons survived to adulthood, but her daughters both died, one before her first birthday, the other at age 4. And after 9 years of marriage, in 1767, her first husband died. He was only 32. Her struggles during the first years of her widowhood come through so clearly in her writings. About a month after her husband's funeral, she sent her mother a letter lamenting her loneliness, which I find so moving. She asks her mother to send her love to her poor, bereaved, disconsolate child. She is broken in pieces. Rather than any conventional closing, she signs this letter to her mother, "Your sorrowful, lonely child." For several years after her husband's death, she struggled with grief and depression, especially after her firstborn and her youngest had died. So here are just some fragments from some of her other letters at the time, if you want to puzzle them out. And not only was she depressed, she needed to find some ways to bring in some money. One way that she found to support herself and her children was by running a boarding house for Yale students and for the representatives to the colony's legislature. And by 1773, she was ready to start looking again at the world around her. She got interested in politics while listening to her boarders and reading the paper, and she started writing to her parents about what she read in the news, as well as about the debates on boycotting tea. 6 weeks before the Boston Tea Party, she told them that there had not been one drop of tea been drinked in any of our family. And that summer of boycotts was when she started to reflect on the problem of the perfect husband. She had been a widow now for 6 years, and she was trying to make sense of both herself and the world around her. We know, of course, that as a rule, marriage is both personal and social. Fish's ideas about marriage were structured by the experiences she had and the world in which she lived. And as I said, Fish grew up in a world of extreme, intense, perhaps is a better word, intense religiosity. Her father was what we might call an awakened or even an evangelical Congregationalist minister. And I'm going to say I don't think there's a lot of evangelical Congregationalists left out there. But that's what he was. And then she married into a world of even more ministers. Those religious ideals were essential to her worldview. But at the same time, so were 18th century British ideas about politeness and gentility. So in this essay on marriage, Christian virtues jostled against 18th century models of male sensibility. In one sentence, and that's blocked out there on the left, Fish insisted that her ideal must have the fear of God always before his eyes, while in the very next sentence, she insisted that he must be genteel in his address and exquisitely delicate in his actions and words. And those two sentences, right there on the left, we can see most clearly her blending of religious and cultural expectations, right? And we see them also in the example I give in the second page on the right, where she's thinking about sociability. As a religious man, she charged her husband, she said, may his doors be open to entertain strangers, thereby fulfilling the divine command. At the same time, however, his idea of entertainment should be refined rather than austere. May he love to see his table spread with the bounties of God's providence, not only with the necessities of life, but sometimes with the comforts and delicacies, like strawberries, as his income will allow. You can see those sentences right there in the box on the right if you want to see how she's jamming these ideas together. You should know that this essay is filled with both direct and indirect quotations from Scripture. Her letters are like that too, and she obviously expected her readers to be able to pick up all the references. But despite the prevalence of religious language, Fish's essay also reads like a mashup of decades of 18th century advice about marriage. So imagine just unending reams of Ann Landers. Men and women alike filled newspapers and magazines with reflections on marriage, and Fish seems to have been an eager consumer. So the Connecticut Gazette, for example, published a mock advertisement for a husband that can be warranted to possess the following agreeable qualifications, including behavior genteel, easy, and graceful. Or the Norwich, Connecticut newspaper reprinted in 1776 an old poem that had been making the rounds entitled The Choice of a Husband, in which the poet listed many of the common themes of an ideal marriage. An impressive collection of doggerel, and some of you know I'm quite fond of newspaper doggerel, but there's an impressive collection of it that was printed in numerous newspapers to remind readers that a good wife spends her time supporting her husband's welfare, happiness, and ease. Didactic commentary on marriage was such a popular genre that editors created collections of these essays, such as The Matrimonial Preceptor, a collection of examples and precepts relating to the married state. The multiple editions of these collections attest to their popularity. Such handbooks seem to come to New York, Rhode Island, and Boston on every ship from London in the 1760s. The Huntington Library owns every edition. I spent a good bit of time this year reading from each of these editions. And I'll say I definitely encourage all of you to make good use of the Huntington's archival materials. But I have to let you know, in this case, the vast majority of the material in the Matrimonial Preceptor is deeply cringy. Almost all of the essays and doggerel consisted of advice addressed to women. But I will point out that a few reflected on men behaving badly, even as they continually reminded women that it was unacceptable for them to respond in kind. The third edition of the Matrimonial Preceptor, for example, contained an entire section on the brutality of husbands. But for the most part, literature focused less on men's outrageous or violent behavior and more on their lack of politeness. A satirical essay on the ingenious and pleasant art of tormenting, addressed to husband, is concerned largely not with violence, but with men's ill humor, sullen discontent, or indifference. Most of the advice literature argued that a happy marriage is one in which the woman recognizes that the man has all the power in a marriage and accepts that as the proper state. Making the same argument, but through satire, other essays derided henpecked husbands whose wives refused to acknowledge their male authority, offering mock toasts such as tyranny to the wife, slavery to the husband, and ruin to the family. Fish, however, was a widow with children and a thoroughly religious and educated person. Accordingly, she could hardly have been naive about what a man's untrammeled power could do to her life and those of her children. As a widow, she had had many years of autonomy, and she did not seem eager to give it up. Her own terms for marriage were not radical, but they were clear. Fish knew how dignity and autonomy should work in her ideal marriage. She always expected that a husband would be the head of a household, the final authority for children, servants, slaves, and herself. May he have a happy talent at governing, she wrote. But at the same time, she made explicit in ways that were similar to, but far clearer than the advice from those contemporary publications, that she expected her husband's power over her to be limited. Such a man would respect their separate, if unequal, spheres of authority. He would be a man, she wrote, who scrutinizes not into the minute affairs of domestic business, which properly belongs to a woman's place. Or, as the matrimonial preceptor put it, if either party keep within their proper department, there need be no disputes about power or superiority. The matrimonial preceptor suggested that affection was what kept the unbridled authoritarianism of a husband in check. Otherwise, one essayist suggested, a marriage contracted without tenderness is a kind of rape. Fish's idea of love was both larger and more specific. Her ideal husband was one who could embrace a Christian idea of agape, or a generous love that allows him to see the best in her, even as he recognizes her human failings. Let the mantle of love be drawn over my imperfections, she wrote in an indirect quote from 1 Corinthians. He could tell her that her opinions were wrong, but she insisted he could not embarrass her in public. Whatever imperfections in her he might note, they are to be discussed in private with all that gentleness, tenderness, and forthrightness that become a husband. Affection and authority, in other words, were to go hand in hand. Now, in addition to this essay and her letters, Fish also composed a memoir when she was in her 60s and 70s. In this memoir, she wrote that when her second husband, who was named Gold-Sellick Silliman, came courting, she handed him this sketch of the ideal husband. After Silliman read it, she claimed that he told her that he was afraid he should not be the character thus described, although he had a wish to be. His modest assessment of his own abilities, Fish wrote, was the most persuasive argument in his favor that he could have made. And actually, the letters that Silliman and Fish exchanged at the time really are very sweet. As he tried to persuade her to give up the independence of widowhood, Silliman assured Fish that it is my most sincere desire to render your life happy and easy. So after 8 years as a widow and single parent, in 1775, Fish married this middle-aged and moderately well-off lawyer who was also a slaveholding farmer. His name, again, because it's so awesome, was Gold-Sellick Silliman. At her marriage, she and those of her sons who were not yet in college moved to the Silliman family farm in Fairfield, Connecticut, on Long Island Sound, which will matter. A few years into the Revolutionary War, Silliman left the Continental Army and took a commission as an officer in the Connecticut militia, while continuing to oversee the enslaved families who worked his farm and continue his work as the state attorney. Their first child was born 2 years later. The 15 years of Fish's second marriage may indeed have been happy, but they don't seem to have been very easy. This second marriage lasted from 1775 to 1790, which are pretty much the traditional dates of the American Revolution. In other words, they married a few weeks after the first battles of Lexington and Concord, so just 250 years ago this month would have been their anniversary. And that marriage lasted until Gold-Selleck Silliman died in 1790, just as George Washington's administration was getting underway. It was, I think I can say without understatement, an eventful time. So when Mary Fish moved into this new marriage, she moved into a new household in a part of Connecticut that was new to her. Lots of things changed. Suddenly, she was living with an adult stepson and his wife, and also with her husband's widowed sister and her daughter. And she moved into one of the largest slaveholding households in Connecticut. Now, enslaved people had always been part of Fish's household, both when she lived with her parents and when she lived in New Haven, both married and widowed. Slavery was endemic to Connecticut, and Fairfield County had the largest percentage of enslaved people in the state at the beginning of the Revolution. So when Fish married Silliman and moved from New Haven down the coast closer to New York, she found herself in an area both less urban and more dependent on slavery than in her previous life. And then I think it's maybe also worth reminding you, that in 1776, less than a year after their marriage, the British Army successfully captured New York City and Long Island, directly across the Long Island Sound from Fish's new house. The impact of the Revolutionary War can be found everywhere in Fairfield once we start looking. In May of 1779, two men enslaved in Fairfield petitioned the Connecticut legislature to end slavery in the state. They used in their petition the very language of revolution, in which they wrote, among other things, "Your honors, who are nobly contending in the cause of liberty, whose conduct excites the admiration and reverence of all the great empires of the world, will not resent our thus freely animadverting on this detestable practice, although our skins are different in color from those who we serve. Yet reason and revelation join to declare that we are the creatures of that God who made of one blood and kindred all the nations of the earth." The Connecticut legislature does not seem to have taken this petition even under consideration. That same week that they presented this petition, May of 1779, local loyalists kidnapped Gold-Selleck Silliman and his adult son and held them hostage in British-occupied New York. They soon released the son, but Fish's husband remained a prisoner for a full year. That summer, the British military turned their attention to Connecticut. In early July of 1779, they landed on the southern coast, attacking first New Haven, including Yale College, and then they landed the next day in Fairfield. And when the British landed, they promised enslaved Connecticut residents that they could find freedom behind the British lines in New York. Meanwhile, so we have a lot of strands coming together here. Meanwhile, Fish, who was then 8 months pregnant, fled to the next town with her toddler son and one of her teenagers, who fortunately was home from college that week. Some of her household, both enslaved and free, came with her. Watching her town burn, hearing the cannon, and camping out in a neighbor's house must have been enormously disconcerting, to say the least. We can, in fact, do more than just imagine how difficult this was for her, because she wrote a long letter to her mother describing the whole situation. Now 42 years old and in her 7th pregnancy, she was sure that she would go into labor within a couple of weeks. Her midwife in Fairfield was now too far away to be able to come quickly once the birth began. Her only option seemed to be the local midwife, who was apparently, she wrote, blind as a stone, which is, she worried, a disagreeable circumstance. In the end, we can maybe see why, she decided to invite her Fairfield midwife to stay with her and the rest of her household in those temporary quarters until the birth. She ended up, in fact, creating something along the lines of a household in exile, in which she tried, not always successfully, to reclaim the balance of power that had sustained this household since she came to Fairfield. Clearly, the events of 1779 created more upheaval in the Silliman family than the taking of the patriarch as hostage. This was not some Odyssey-like story in which everything goes back to normal once Odysseus comes back and beats up some guys. War and slavery together turned the home front into a battlefront for gendered authority. When the British Navy raided the Connecticut coast that summer, the upheaval created opportunities for enslaved people. Some did flee to New York, where they hoped the British would protect them. Others decided not to take their chances with an army and an occupied city. The families enslaved on the Silliman farm apparently did not leave with the British. Instead, from later hints in her children's accounts, they may have forced Fish to renegotiate the terms of their labor. Gold-Selleck Silliman was finally released in the spring of 1780. The role that Fish played in this release is fascinating and dramatic and a little too long for me to tell here, but again, maybe in the Q&A. At any rate, Silliman lives another 10 years, and he dies in 1790, when his youngest sons are 11 and 13. So I'll pass lightly here over Fish's next 10 years, as I watch the clock, in which she scrambles again to provide for her children, especially, and I feel this deeply, especially the college tuitions for her youngest children. About 1800, however, she sold the Silliman farm to her oldest son and essentially retired. She moved in with her various sons and their families, and she enjoyed it thoroughly. As she wrote to her youngest son, "I never, since I was a housekeeper, or since I broke up housekeeping, had such a time as I have now for reading, writing, and contemplation." I mean, isn't that what we all want from retirement? But then comes a twist in this story. In 1804, when she was in her late 60s, she met a man and started to think about marriage again. Let me emphasize here that actually, right now, we know very little about postmenopausal marriage in the early Republic. But miraculously, I have found letters from both Fish and her third husband about their courtship. In ways that seem somewhat on brand, Fish spends a lot more time in her letters perseverating about this relationship than her husband does. In fact, some friends here in the audience have characterized Mary Fish as Bridget Jones meets Hamilton, and these letters really do support that tagline. So, in the late winter of 1804, Fish apparently went on a road trip with 70-year-old Dr. John Dickinson. He was a cousin of the more famous John Dickinson, who served in all the Continental and Constitutional Congresses. So, while Dickinson, at the end of the trip, simply wrote to his daughter and son-in-law that he had just returned from a trip in which, as I have here, "I visited Mrs. Silliman, widow of General Silliman of Fairfield, who was recommended to me by Judge Sturgis. I believe she," he means here his daughter, "will know her, and if she has any hesitation, let me know it speedily." Fish's letters are a lot juicier. So in a letter written just a day after Dickinson's, Fish wrote to one of her sons that he, Dickinson, came here again yesterday, but is now gone home, and notice all these underlines, and it is most likely that our particular acquaintance, for weighty reasons, will soon end, but I hope friendship will naturally continue. This you may keep to yourselves for the present. The relationship was clearly a matter of discussion among her friends as well as her family. Fish obviously knew that people were gossiping. She writes later in the letter, "It is rather disagreeable at my time of life to be a subject of so much anecdote. But as things have taken place, I have not known how to avoid it." And the relationship apparently did not go smoothly. Both national and personal politics seem to have played a role. Now, Fish was obviously deeply invested in party politics. She even for a while stops framing her writing in this scriptural language that she's always used, and she goes right to politics. So look at this way of talking about putting the relationship on hold. She says, "Suffice it to say that reports to the disadvantage of the candidate brought me to a determination to negative the matter," right? Just to point out here, she means to veto it. And in fact, although the conflict between them, she says, related to domestic matters, she claims that at least one of her sons is concerned that it is a Democratic maneuver to disappoint a staunch Federalist. Now, Fish was a hardcore Federalist at a time when the Federalist Party was disappearing almost everywhere in the United States except Connecticut. A Democratic maneuver, whatever it might actually have been, I'm still figuring this out. But a Democratic maneuver is definitely about the worst insult that staunch Federalist Mary Fish could imagine. And if you want some sense of how contentious party politics were in 1804, I'll just remind you that in July of that year, Democratic Republican Aaron Burr shot Federalist Alexander Hamilton in a duel that was as much about party politics as it was about any personal rivalry, despite what a certain musical might have told you. At any rate, for a while, this courtship seems to have floundered and horribly embarrassed them both. Fish writes, "It has been a great mortification." And then, 2 weeks later, they seem to have cleared everything up. Dickinson's son-in-law wrote cheerfully to his sister, "As for news, the principal and most important is that our good old father was married on the 19th instant to the widow of the late General Silliman of Fairfield, and everything bespeaks them fair. She bears a good character and really is a fine, amiable old lady, aged about 67, and undoubtedly will be a comfort to the old gentleman and family." The entire marriage was far more carefully arranged than this breezy letter might suggest. Fish and Dickinson crafted a prenuptial agreement. When Dickinson died 7 years later, his will made it clear that they had never combined their estates. Fish obviously did not remarry for financial security. She married, as she had hoped so many years before, for companionship. Given the depth of feeling in her letters, she may even have enjoyed, in the polite language of the 18th century, the ardent affection that she longed for in that portrait of her ideal husband. As I draw to a close, I want to offer just a moment of reflection on letters themselves. It is the letters that begin to reveal Fish as a person and to reveal her world. Letters were the lifeblood of the 18th century world, and people of all races, statuses, and ages participated in their exchange. But it is clear that writing was much more than just a functional means of communication, at least for Mary Fish. 250 years later, her distinctive voice comes through her letters as she placed her own life and feelings in the scenes that she set and the emotions she evoked. It's not surprising that when Fish had her portrait painted at the age of 58, she had herself represented with a book in her hand and 2 more at her elbow. She understood and defined herself by the power of the written word. Now, I have to admit, when I first started reading these letters, they were often boring. There was no plot, not a lot of drama, nothing really seemed to happen. And also, I didn't know any of the people. But as I've been reading, I've come to realize 2 things. First, as I hope you can see, there are stories in there, but they're embedded deeply. It takes time and effort to find them and pull them out. And secondly, I've come to realize that the letters themselves are part of the story. In other words, sometimes the content of a letter was less important than the letter itself. So as we get towards the end of my time here, I want to share with you one of my favorite finds in the Huntington collections that I found this year. This letter is not from Fish, but from a woman who was writing in 1774 from a town not far from Fairfield. She's writing to her cousin. She says, "Dear cousin, I now sit down to write to you to let you know I'm still alive, an undeserved favor, and should be glad to know if you are living." She goes on to say, "Seems almost an age since I have heard from you." She says, "Pray, what is the matter? Have you lost the use of your fingers that you cannot write? Or does your children cry so that you can't attend to write? Well, if that is the case, I will forgive you. Now, my dear, I have nothing new to tell you, for that the sun rises and sets in the same place it did last year at this time would be no news, or that we ate and drank and sleep would be the same worth." For Mary Fish and so many others, they thought that these letters were really just a way to check in. But as they wrote them, they unconsciously embedded many fragments of their lives. And my work as a historian is to pull out these tiny shards and show us the patterns that they make. This kind of work makes it possible for us to meet other people in the past, people whose lifespans don't intersect with our own, but nonetheless leave a trace on this earth. Archives and curators and libraries like the Huntington make it possible for us to find these people and visit their worlds. And our conversations with each other as we do this work is what allows us to make sense of what we are reading. So thank you to the Huntington, to the wonderful and imperiled world of libraries and archives and museums, and to all of you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, and I will bring the microphone around to you if you raise your hand. Yep, coming.
Thank you. It was fascinating to learn about this woman through her letters. I just wondered about your perspective for the future, given that we don't write letters anymore. How will historians, do you think, picture our world or have a sense of who we are?
I mean, I think, of course, it's a wonderful question, and our source bases change, of course. I work in the 18th century in part because I get overwhelmed by all of the stuff that's produced after the age of the typewriter. People could write so fast at that point. There's an immense amount. And now, of course, it's very unclear, right, what people write. People don't write in the same length anymore. People write things that disappear. But I do think, we still live and we are still here. And I think that the ways in which we talk and communicate and share our lives with each other, we do in ways that we don't even realize, right? How much of the world in which we're living is sort of stuck to what we're doing, right? It's sort of the dust that sticks to the clay. And that, I think, historians will figure out how to extricate. Not right away, but it will be there. They will not do the same kind of work. People don't write the same kind of ways. People also don't talk about their marriages like this anymore. I'm not going to say it's all bad. So things change. I think that we will still, in the future, be able to discover our lives.
I'm coming around.
You made reference to the letters. Well, I mean, it's hundreds of years ago. Why are they extant? How did that happen?
Yes, thank you. That is such a fun story. So her youngest son, the one who is born while the British are shelling Fairfield, is named Benjamin Silliman. And I know there's at least one chemist in this room who may know who he is, but he becomes or any of you with any Yale connections will know, he becomes a major chemist in the 1830s and 1840s. He knows nothing about chemistry. He sort of starts as first he's a school teacher, and then he's a lawyer, and then the president of Yale says, well, actually, we kind of need a chemist. And he says, I don't know anything about chemistry. And the president says, that's okay. Like, you know, you can go to Europe for a couple of years, meet some people, read some stuff, go to some lectures, and come back, and we're going to have a chemistry department. And while we're at it, let's have a geology department. So, and in fact, you know, his geology samples apparently are still being used for teaching samples at Yale. So he comes back, he creates this department, but he becomes best known really because he's the one that uncovers, puts together, however we talk about scientific knowledge, the chemical formula for fracking, for fractal distillation. It is his son, her grandson, Benjamin Silliman Jr., who figures out its application to petroleum in the late 1850s. And as a result of this, they become, both of them, but especially Benjamin Silliman Sr., you know, very important figures, especially to Yale. Silliman himself, you know, he's quite young still. He's, you know, definitely the, you know, he's only in his 30s as his mother is remarrying for that last time. And they're quite close. And he collects at some point, he's the one who asks her to write that memoir. He collects all of her letters, as many as he can find, and to sort of to guide his own spiritual path. She's kind of worried that he's sort of lost his way. And when he dies, all his papers just go to Yale, and they get boxed up in these boxes called family papers. And this is the huge contribution of the Buells is, you know, in the 1970s and 1980s, when people started doing women's history, people start looking for these things called family papers, and they were the ones that dug them out of, you know, this enormous archive, and they just, where they had sat undisturbed.
Did you have a hand up here?
Thank you, Serena. That was really fun. So I'll give you the chance to tell the story of how she gets him released.
Thank you. So some of you may know that in the mid-1990s or 94 or something like that, PBS made a docudrama based on the 1779, the year that Gold Selleck Silliman was kidnapped. They don't talk about many of the other things I talked about here, but they tell this dramatic story of his release, which some of which is indeed true. So what happens is she does spend a lot of time, as do other people, trying to arrange just a prisoner exchange. There's an enormous world, really, an economy of hostage taking and hostage exchange across Long Island Sound. And initially they think it's going to be pretty easy to do an exchange. And because, you know, because he doesn't have the status as a continental officer anymore, it's very difficult to get him exchanged. So eventually they decide that, you know, regular channels aren't working super well. They can't just petition. And she has made friends earlier in the war with I think it's a second cousin of her father, who's a privateer. And with the help of some other people, they arrange that this privateer will engage in this whole world of exchange taking and will go to Long Island and take another Yalie, as he was another Yale lawyer, that I think they figured a one-to-one of Yale lawyers was what's going to work best. And in fact, they were not wrong. And so they take this this man who's in fact a judge. They manage to grab him. They bring him back to Fairfield. He is super grouchy about being taken. Apparently, his wife is a lot less unhappy about it. She writes, I don't know why. I mean, it's true, we've had all the conversation about marriage, but she does write Fish this letter saying, you know, thanks so much for being so nice to my husband. She'd had him over to breakfast and said, you know, and here's some tea, some tea as a gift. But Fish finds him actually really super unpleasant and unsociable, and holds on to him until they actually arrange and exchange. And then in this crazy coincidence that is genuine, the day that there are many pitfalls on the way to this exchange. Other things were supposed to happen. The grumpy judge was supposed to be exchanged. They had it all set. And then he went sledding or sleighing, and he falls out of the sleigh and he hurts his hip, and then he can't go on the exchange. And, and so then Gold Selleck can't come home because the guy can't travel because he's got a bruised hip. The story kind of goes on and on. But eventually, they do get him on a boat at the same time that they had arranged, finally, that regardless, this exchange was going to work with Silliman. And the two ships actually meet, crossing Long Island Sound, and swap guys. But sort of a great moment. And she's deeply engaged in this world of hostage exchange. As are all the wives.
So, Serena, I want to ask you a question because Sue made this connection between teaching and research. So I want to make this connection too with regard to letters. When I had students go into the archives and read letters and diaries, I had a student once who said, "I think this is wrong. I just feel really uncomfortable. We're not supposed to be reading these things." And the archivist and I both said, "Hey, this is what historians do. This is what we do for fun." So I was wondering how you, and which is true. I mean, I have, arguably read as many family letters as you have, and I take great pleasure in this and getting into their lives. But I've also, since that conversation, been a lot more thinking about my responsibility towards the people whose letters I read and write about. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think I might, at least with these letters, I think I would disagree with your student. The letters are meant to be shared. They say that pretty clearly and pretty frequently, right? Both at the end, they say hi to all these people. But she often writes quite explicitly as to the people who write to her, that they expect these to be shared. They expect the letters to be handed around. That's why she says so explicitly to her son, keep this in the family for the moment, right? She certainly expects all of her sons are going to read this letter, or all of her sons who are in Connecticut, to read the letters. And I think that they do intend most of these to be exchanged and handed around. So I think that the ideal of privacy isn't really wound into these letters. I guess I'd say that. So I don't feel bad about it at all. I love them.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more. Or we could convene for champagne and strawberries. Let's thank Serena again.
Thank you all.